Hello and welcome to this edition of The Debate on France 24. I'm Andrea Sankey in Paris. Tonight, winning the war, losing the peace. 40 years after Israel triumphed over its Arab neighbors in the 1967 war, the fighting continues. An entire region pays the price. With Palestinian land still occupied, Lebanon and Syria still technically at war with Israel, and no single peace plan fully enacted over decades of efforts, some are questioning how much to celebrate on the 40th anniversary of the Six-Day War. Joining me tonight to debate its legacy, Hind Khoury, Chief Delegate of Palestine in France, Michel Zlotowski, correspondent from Israeli Public Radio, Kol Israel, Soufiane Ramahi, a Palestinian journalist, and Nina Ben-Ami, spokesperson for the Israeli Embassy in Paris. Thanks all so much for joining us.
Welcome.
Let's begin with establishing some personal sentiment on the events of 40 years ago. Nina, I'll start with you. What does the Six-Day War, as an Israeli, mean to you?
Well, I wasn't born yet when the Six-Day War began, but in terms of Israeli consciousness, it was really a moment of triumph and a miracle that Israel came out of the Six-Day War not only not destroyed, but having survived and having won the war with a resounding triumph. What came afterwards was a missed opportunity, perhaps, to reach peace, and that's something that we look forward to achieving in the future. But it was a moment, it was not clear at the time how the war would end. It was, in Israel, from what I understand, all the news footage that I've seen, there was a sentiment that the state could have been wiped out. It was a 19-year-old country. They'd never had a war. There were sandbags that were being brought in. There were coffins that were being prepared. We didn't know what was going to happen. And so
Do you think there's reason, however,
relief
to be celebrating today, in hindsight?
I think yes, because I think if we hadn't won the Six-Day War, then perhaps we wouldn't be here today to be talking about the future. In other words, there was a real existential danger at the time. It was a war against three Arab armies that attacked on three different fronts. And there are those in Israel who would argue that the victory that we had in the Six-Day War was what led to the peace with Egypt afterwards, because there was a consciousness that we could no longer destroy Israel, so we had to reach a peace.
Okay. Hind Khoury, your sentiments?
Well, I was 13 during the war, and I remember the big deceptions because we didn't expect to lose that way. But I have to admit it brought some realism into the Palestinian agenda. There was Israel with borders, with a culture, and it brought us to recognize Israel in 1988 and sign Oslo. Unfortunately, what came along was a squandering of opportunity, as Nina has said. And I think it's even worse than that, because we've had euphorias and deceptions ever since of peace plans that have always been frustrated, and not only that, it brought us where we are today. Palestinian, under siege, in total misery, with checkpoints everywhere, their life is completely suffocated, and also a growth of extremism and violence, and not only in the Palestinian areas, but also in the whole region. Which signals a possible explosion. I mean, how much have we lost? I don't think it's only really lost opportunities. And unfortunately, the way I see it is Israel, yes, won the war, but also won a lot of arrogance and never got over it. Because they never changed the policy of taking land and more land and trying to get rid of Palestinian. And I find the disengagement of Gaza, the ghettoization of the West Bank, the construction of the wall, the suffocation of the Palestinian economy and social fabric is really behind more idea of getting rid of Palestinians and taking the land.
Okay, Michel.
Well, I have different memories. I was born too when the Six-Day War erupted. I was 20, and I remember mostly the days before the war started. And I can very well remember the feeling of fear, despair, and anguish, because we were absolutely convinced that something terrible will happen to Israel with all those armies on the verge of invading it. And the aim was crystal clear. Everyone said it from the Arab side. It was to destroy, uproot, and do away with Israel. So we were in a state of real fear. And after the war started, after the few hours when the Egyptian Air Force was totally destroyed on the ground, and after a few days when we felt that the victory was at hand and something tremendous happened around the world. I mean, there was a tremendous change. But it was mostly, for me, what I remember is the relief from this feeling of fear and anguish.
Soufiane.
Yes, to be honest with you, I am I had in that time about 20 years. I was at university in Beirut. For me, it was a second Nakba, as we said, the Palestinians.
A catastrophe.
A catastrophe. I didn't imagine that I will be again a refugee. My family left in 48. Then I was obliged to leave in 67, and I became me again. Second time, for the second time, I was a refugee. So at the same time, it was a nightmare for my generation. Mm-hmm. But in the other side, we in the Arab world, I mean, even my generation, we discovered that we were dreaming the epoch of President Nasser. After this catastrophe, we understood what's going on in the Arab world. We have to change. And I think from one part it was a catastrophe, mm-hmm. a Nakba, but on the other hand, the Arab world has awakened, and people they become understand what's going on. And something to say for my neighbors Israeli, in that epoch, the Israeli they were dreaming that they could talk with the Arabs. And Mr. Moshe Dayan, he was waiting in his office, beside his telephone, that the President Nasser or His Majesty King Hussein will call him to make peace or to talk. But the things it goes in other way. Now even the Israeli they were dreaming just to have talks with the Arabs. Now they don't like to have peace. We have offered for them, for the Palestinians, even all the Arab leaders, they offered for the Israelis the peace, but the Israelis now, they are not capable to make peace with the Arabs.
Right. Well, a lot has happened over the 40 years since that war, but let me ask you still, during those 6 days, with 3 Arab armies against 1 that had only very recently been established,
excuse me, I have to trump you. It's not, the reality is something different.
Okay, go ahead.
Israel was more strong than the 3 Arab armies. They were held by the Americans, and they had the last technology in that time. The Arabs,
it's not quite true.
This is the reality. You don't know.
A number of historical accounts will argue that the Americans helped
exactly,
later, but at that point, Israel really hadn't gotten much assistance from the Americans. From the French, yes.
To be honest with you, the Arabs in that time, mainly the Egyptians, they didn't understand. Even I don't know, Madame l'Ambassadeur. I think maybe she said she has 15. I think the Arabs, we were defeated because we didn't understand what does it mean, espionage, spying. We were naive. The Israeli, they were capable to destroy all the Egyptian air army within 1 hour.
I think historical events are important in the way they give lessons to the future. And I think the failure was in not taking the lessons enough so that we can establish this peace that is desired by all people in the region. And instead, we have sown chaos in the region, we have sown violence and a lot of hatred. So there has been not, let's look for responsibilities, I think, because the aim really is, are we going to get out of this mess we're in? And the picture looks very gloomy these days. Let's say it on all sides. I don't think Israel really is interested in making this peace. They're continuously ignoring the Palestinian partner and finding every excuse. Palestinians are also falling into chaos due to the situation we're living in. The Arab world, where I don't know if we've learned the lesson in 1967, because I still think the strategic depth for Palestinian is the Arab world, but the Arab world is still not united enough to force through any kind of political solution. The Arab Peace Initiative, I think, is a great opportunity, but it does still require a lot more diplomacy and finance behind it to pull it through. And I think it is the only plan on the table.
I'd like to move into future prospects in a moment.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Michel.
I agree with most of what Hinda just said, except one thing. The real partner and the real support for the Palestinian is not the Arab world. And you haven't learned that yet. You have to understand that the only real support for an Arab state and for an and for a Palestinian independence in the area is Israel. As long as you don't get that, we won't move forward. You are not, the Arab states are not your allies. If you have not got the point.
No, it's not the allies, but we don't seem to be able to get our rights from Israel. I mean, we have compromised 78% of historic Palestine. We agreed to live on 22%, and still we have to compromise that. We barely have 11% left with all the colonies, and we still have to negotiate. We're not even getting to negotiations. Yes, we would like to come, and that's what the idea of Yasser Arafat, probably his genius in a way. He wanted to come to an agreement directly with Israel on bilateral basis, and our hopes went really high in 1993.
Put so many hurdles on the way to it.
I have to interject here, just for a moment, with respect. One brief disagreement with my friend here, the Palestinian journalist, Sofian, thank you. I think Israel won the Six-Day War because we had no choice, and there was a unity of spirit and a sense of a war that we fought to protect ourselves, to survive, and that was the source of our victory, not American technology, which came later, and not espionage. I mean, that was good, perhaps military intelligence, but that was it was a war that we could not afford to lose. And as for the future, I think that we have to find a way forward, that the Israeli government has said, and Mr. Olmert has said repeatedly, we want to have peace talks with the Arab League. The Arab plan that's on the table is something that we agree to talk about, we'd like to pursue. The Prime Minister has invited the leaders of all of the Arab countries to come to Israel to continue these talks. And if we have to be very honest, the problem is the Hamas terrorist group that's in the Palestinian government.
I mean, let's read all the international organization reports, take Amnesty International, the World Bank, International Labour Organization, OCHA, just what have you. Everybody's saying that the situation Palestinians live through now, with all these checkpoints, with the wall, with the closure of the Jordan Valley, with the daily aggression, with the daily assassination, is suffocating the social and economic fabric to death. I mean, life of Palestinians is so miserable. It's being described in every other article, everywhere, on internet, on television, everywhere. Why is this so? I mean, there is, and people say, and authority says, it's not for security reasons. I live through the checkpoint. I know it's not for security reasons. There is a plan to get us out of the country. Why do you make our life so impossible? I mean, that's how my reading of it, right? When I live in a Bethlehem ghetto like this, when I know that there's no more work for anybody, no more hope for those young people to study and to have work, and no movement anywhere. I mean, 7 kilometers is Jerusalem from Bethlehem. A whole generation doesn't know what Jerusalem looked like from Bethlehem. So all these tells me that Israel hasn't changed its policy, and that's my personal interpretation, probably others. We take land, that's what the wall does, take as much land built within Palestinian territory, separating Palestinian, making 1/3 of the West Bank population directly affected, making their life real misery every day. I mean, that's not a sign of peace or wanting to talk. Yes, I would love to do it with Israel, and these should be the partner. But we've been trying from 93, and we're just being worse off, and so fast every day. How do you explain the colonization and the bypass route, the whole gruyere that we live in the West Bank? I mean, it's not news. It's not news. There has to be reasons for this. There is no justification for it, and certainly is a bad sign. And what we're getting on the Palestinian side, we have a national unity government approved by 96% of the population. And who's setting the agenda? The 2% persons, militias who are out of the law are setting the agenda of the day.
You have a real problem inside of Palestinian society.
In Israel as well. I think the people on the right and the people in the colonies who have been setting the agenda for Israel for ever so long. Yes, more colonies. Yes, they're still now celebrating, even today, some new colony somewhere. I think. I mean, where are we heading? Why isn't there recognition of Palestinian rights as people? I think we have been denied partnership in 1948. In 1967, there was this overture.
Okay, still, let Lena respond.
We need to be recognized. We have rights.
The Israeli side. Go ahead.
Rights for life. That's all.
Go ahead.
Simple.
Israel wants a two-state solution. It's the main idea in the Israeli body politic. The Israeli public wants to see two states, Israel and Palestine, side by side, living in peace, in coexistence. And Israel wants to have negotiations with the Palestinian government. It's not our fault that the Palestinian people have elected Hamas democratically. It's the legitimate government.
Negotiations failed before Hamas, even. Abu Mazen was begging. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I'm listening to you because I'm hearing your pain, and I understand, and I can only imagine how difficult it is to be a Palestinian right now and to live in this situation. But you have to look at the context to see where did the situation come from. It's irresponsible to only blame Israel, and to claim that we don't want peace. If we have the fence put up. It's as a response to the terrorism attacks that were sending suicide bombers to explode in our cities. And one last word, the tents can come down tomorrow.
We're going to continue this discussion after a short 12-minute break. Now quickly for news and headlines. We will be back with more on this debate. Do stay with us. Welcome back to this edition of The Debate on France 24. I'm Andrea Sankey, and tonight we've been discussing the legacy of the Six-Day War. 40 years after Israel triumphed over 3 Arab neighbors, is there reason for Israelis to celebrate? Here again to debate that tonight, Hind Khoury, Chief Delegate of Palestine in France, Michel Sotovsky, correspondent from Israeli Public Radio Kol Israel, Soufiane Ramahi, a Palestinian journalist, and Nina Ben Ami, spokesperson for the Israeli Embassy in Paris. Thanks all again so much for joining us. I'll start to my right again. There was, when Israel first claimed victory in 1967, this overwhelming belief, perhaps a misconception, some might argue, that many saw the speed of the triumph in just 6 days as a sign that there was some kind of divine intervention. Has that belief today completely disappeared? And do the majority of Israelis today actually feel that that victory was mismanaged, primarily in the form of settling occupied territories?
I think at the time there was a sense of redemption, that the war was won in such a short time, and those who had religious or messianic tendencies were enthused by the way the victory was won in such a convincing way in such a short time. And I think that today the regret perhaps in the Israeli public is that that victory has not yet been translated into peace for the Israeli people. Israel, since it was founded, has stretched out its hand, has asked for peace. The day after the Six-Day War, as my friend said, there was this idea, Moshe Dayan said, my phone is here, I want the Arab nations to call me and let's sue for peace. We won this territory, let's give it back and have peace. That's all we asked for. And in the meantime, there was the Khartoum conference in Sudan in August, and there was no peace and no recognition and no negotiation with Israel. And we're living in a region in which the problem isn't just how to manage the peace, but there's a problem of extremism. There's a problem of those who do not see a two-state solution, but see eradication of Israel from the map as the solution. We have Mr. Ahmadinejad in Iran, who's called for that this week. So we're not living in Europe in the Middle East. We have real forces of religious extremism that want to see Israel still eradicated.
If there were these conciliatory tones, though, that you're mentioning, Michelle, I'll ask you, why did Israel occupy? Why did Israel put settlers into disputed territories?
I think the victory was mismanaged, that's for sure. And let me remind you that David Ben-Gurion meant to establish the capital city of Israel in 1948 in Tel Aviv, not elsewhere, because he knew that Jerusalem was a very thorny issue, very difficult problem. He was talked into because he had to include in his government some religious leaders. He was talked into putting the capital city in Jerusalem. This was probably the beginning of it all. And in 1967, after the victory, when the whole of the city was reunited, when the old city of Jerusalem was reunited to the city of Jerusalem, this was also probably a political mistake. There was no real political issue for that. The second point is that Moshe Dayan, who was the defense minister at the time, had advocated not to go until the Jordan River, so as to leave enough room and not to start a new wave of refugees leaving the area towards Jordan, which seeded a new problem over there. So, with all this management of the victory, the seeds were planted for future trouble, and this is what happened. And of course, after the 1967 war, I didn't feel it when I was there, that people were feeling that there was a divine intervention. Not in most of the people, certainly not. Probably the minority, the religious minority, felt it this way, but not the vast majority of the Israelis. And we became arrogant. And that's true.
That's true. Well, then let's look at the other side. What did the Arab leaders in the region, the Palestinian leaders, do wrong after if Israel did reach out at certain instances for peace, why didn't the Palestinians reach out back?
Well, I mean, the blame game cannot end, I think. And yes, there was a growth of Palestinian nationalism immediately after 1967, where they decided to take things in their own hand. The Arab world, the ideology of pan-Arabism was lost, and instead we saw gradually a growth of political Islam. But I want to go back to what Nina said, because she said now the problem is this growth of terrorism and growth of extremism. It's actually the result of a policy where not only Israel is responsible, but the international community is equally responsible, of total lawlessness. I mean, there is no respect to any resolution of the UN now for 40 years. There is no respect to human rights laws. There is no respect to the Geneva Convention. I mean, that's a world governance system that was put in place after two horrible world wars, and there were lessons learned. And now, soon after the Second World War, we ignore and we forget about the importance of this international law. This is the problem. Lawlessness has brought more lawlessness and chaos. And this is the problem we have today. And if we don't get back to law and order, unfortunately, the whole region is doomed to more extremism and violence. And we see the surprises every day. I'm not surprised this is happening in Lebanon. It's horribly miserable and sad, but actually the surprises never stop. The war in Lebanon in the summer. I mean, when are we going to just stand and listen to reason and listen to law and order and try to analyze things? What are the reasons for the situation we're in today, and address the issue as they should be? And I think law and order, international law, is the only solution.
Go ahead,
Sufyan. Yes, I would like to to remind most of my friends here that even, in spite of what we have said, I agree with you that the Israelis, they became arrogant. That's right. I think there was a historical way to find a solution with the Palestinians and also with the Arabs after 1967 war. But unfortunately, the Israelis, they thought that they were victorious. Just to remind you, maybe you have one year. In March 1968, the Palestinians, they kicked with the Jordan army, they kicked out the forces of Mr. Moshe Dayan, what we call the Marakat al-Karama for the Palestinians. It was a great, yes, it was a great victory for the Arabs. So for the Arabs, they said, we try to find a way. Then 73, to remind you for the history, the Arabs, the Egyptians and the Syrians, in spite of all of this, they were victorious. So it was, and there was with the United Nations, the United Nations Resolution 242. It was recognizing the relation between Arabs, the Arab countries, and the Israelis. Never Israel and the Americans, they accepted to apply 242, the solution of the concerning the war. So if, for example, if the Americans and the Israelis or the Occident, they accepted to apply this resolution, it could be maybe we are not in the situation actual. And to remind you, my dear,
a different history, because I know that Israel accepted the 242 resolution,
but never
and it was the Palestinian side that only in 1988 recognized the resolution.
No.
It was a resolution called
the Palestinians. Listen, even in 48. Madame
Shukri, when the PLO recognized it.
The Palestinians in 48, they didn't refuse the division, the resolution of the United Nations. The Arab countries, but the Palestinians, they didn't say no. We accepted 2 states. The history, this is, I read the law, never, I defy anyone to find this is history, but we can't remake history, but anyhow, what happened now happened. Now we just try to look for the future.
Sure.
I feel that the best way to apply a kind of resolution for 242 or other resolutions, to find a way with the and Oslo agreement, Oslo, what happened in Oslo. Mr. Abbazin, the President Abbazin, he was the engineer of this agreement. I think it's time to apply this agreement now.
There's more on the table, I think. Anyhow, it's not just like we can apply 242. We can also have a normalization of relation between the Arab world, Arab Muslim world, and Israel. Well, Israel can be integrated in the region. I think it's almost an irresistible plan where Israel will get everything it ever wanted, so to speak, against illegally occupied territories, and it should be a good deal. And a solution, of course, to the refugee problem, and we know what's happening.
In that, though, can we
Palestinians in
establish
Lebanon.
that Israelis have let go entirely of the dream of a greater Israel?
Absolutely.
That's gone.
I think on public level, on the governmental level, there are some fringe groups. There are always some crazies in every country, but I perhaps should soften
And
my
you're
language.
convinced-
There are extremists, but I'm convinced that the Israeli people and the Israeli government, which is what counts, in other words, in terms of what decides, has said on the record and has acted also to promote a two-state solution. Let's just remember, in other words, the idea of giving land for territory is something that we have implemented. It's not just empty talks.
But
That's
when we
how-
see a leader like Benjamin Netanyahu, who we are now seeing serious prospects for in the upcoming election, he may take over the prime minister's post. He is a man that does not believe Israel should release the settlements. And he at least believes in better even solidifying claims to disputed territories in the name of Israeli security.
Occupied territories.
Occupied territory, whatever the terminology you want to use.
It's a far cry
But
from
when
him
you
to become prime minister,
perhaps a
let me
far
tell
cry,
you.
but the prospect is there. Many have said it. If there are those prospects out there, what do you think the prospects for progress really are? And it's not just Benjamin Netanyahu winning the election. There's an entire party behind him and millions of supporters in Israel that believe in what his party stands for.
The Likud party has also renounced the idea of greater Israel. And the most hawkish people in the Likud have
They've
said
renounced the idea of greater Israel, but they will not renounce the idea of the settlements.
certain settlements, and even on the Palestinians, even in Camp David in the year 2000, certain settlements are, the idea is that they will be annexed, and in return, other parts of Israel will be given back to the Palestinians, so that there's 100% exchange of territory. We were this close in 2000 when the negotiations happened between Mr. Arafat, President Clinton, and Barak. Everything, the lines of this future agreement are there. They're written on in sand. They're written on the wall. The question is to have the political will on both sides to implement it. And I just want to say something that Hun said that I really agree with about the threat of lawlessness and how that is really at base a problem for the region, because if in the Palestinian territories, if we don't reach a situation in which the Palestinian people can walk around the streets safely, not because of Israeli soldiers, but because there are Hamas people and militias running around in the streets with AK-7s shooting in the air, and people can't move around, never mind Israelis, but because of the disorder within within Gaza, it'll be terrible.
Since '88, we have been left without police. And I remember I lived through the first Intifada. Until Oslo, we have kept law and order without any police in Palestinian society because of the social cohesion. You're talking about Palestine today after 40 years of a very oppressive occupation. Yes, our social and economic fabric has been torn up to bits. It's a reality. But we still need to get out of it. We're still saying the only way out for now, we think, is a two-state solution. And the option for a two-state is within a very narrow period. I mean, Amnesty says, and ILO says, the reality has changed so much on the ground. We can't talk about a viable state. Or was it OCHA, actually? Very soon, we can't talk about a viable state. So either we come along together and come to establish the state within the 1967 borders, according to international law, or we're losing the chance. That's where we're heading, and very, very fast, unfortunately. The question is, Israel, I think, even with Kadima, they don't have a political program to fit the situation. They're still stuck with the unilateral plan of Sharon. They're not getting out of it. And that's the major problem because, and we know unilateralism did not work. It failed in Lebanon, it failed in Gaza, it will continue to fail every day. If you have a disagreement, you have to come to an agreement, you have to negotiate with the other party. Otherwise, we're not going to reach anywhere. Abu Mazen has been asking. Abu Mazen has been begging for negotiations, and he is a mastermind, as Sufyan said, for Oslo. He said within a year we can finish, because as you said in Taba, we've reached so far. Yes, but what Israel did with Abu Mazen since he won the elections in 2005, he wasn't credible in any one of the minor agreements he reached with. Remember the agreement he signed with Sharon in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think in February 2005, nothing was implemented. I was in the government. We spent months just talking about the criteria, which prisoner should be liberated, and it never got anywhere anyhow. You know, there were deployments from 5 towns. It never was realized. And because he was discredited all the time, we had no money. Every month was a major struggle to get the salaries even paid. There's no money to provide real services, real growth, real reforms. He was discredited, and then he lost the elections in 2006. Of course, because that political program completely failed. It only brought frustration and misery. And the checkpoints date way before.
Do not forget corruption.
No, I'm sorry, let's not talk about corruption, because you have plenty of it in Israel. I mean, there is corruption everywhere. I think Palestinian corruption was exaggerated to serve a political... I'm not for corruption, but we were already implementing a very interesting public sector reform program since 2003. Very interesting. We have a very transparent finance ministry headed by Salam Fayyad. I mean, it was an example to follow.
Hamas is in the government. The prime minister is from
now we have
Hamas.
a
It doesn't
national
recognize
unity
Israel's
government.
right to exist.
We don't have a Hamas government. We have a national
The
unity
national unity
government.
government.
in the
In the government.
Yes,
in the
it is in the
government.
government. So is Qadim. So is what's Lieberman's party, who speaks about the transfer of Palestinians. Only a few days ago, he came with his plan to lock Gaza and consider it as enemy territory and do this and that. So you have people also in your country that do not acknowledge any Palestinian rights. So there's governments and
We
they
have
have
less than a
programs.
minute left.
There are governments and they have programs. We
Yes,
have.
I would like to just to say the following for my friends. I think the Israeli politics now, they have pushed the Palestinians to the maximum, radical. And we, in future, you and us, we will suffer from the radical movements in Gaza and even in West Bank.
I think the Israelis acknowledge that as well. Let me just
You
ask
have
one
to
final
be- you
question.
have to be careful.
Since
You know,
1967,
really, I-
did the greatest ray of hope, since 1967, did the greatest ray of hope, because you've all mentioned this, come via the Oslo Peace Accords? Was that the one time when you all thought, if this is implemented, we can work this out?
There has been a
And
lot
seeing
of...
some,
I
most
think
heads
so,
nod.
absolutely.
Yeah, well, it's not
With
only
international
Oslo. I think
recognition
Oslo
that
is
was
there's
there.
international legitimacy there.
Okay.
There are international resolutions. There's 242, 338. There
And
is,
again,
there's
Oslo
an
is
agreement.
direct negotiations between Palestinians and
And
Israelis.
And Israelis,
Yeah.
exactly.
Without godfathers.
We're going to have to
No,
leave it there.
yes,
Unfortunately,
but
we're
remember,
completely
Oslo
out of
did not
time for
work.
this edition of the
Remember
debate.
that
We're
it
over,
took all these
actually.
years.
I'd like to thank our
Oslo did not
panel so much for joining us. Kin Khoury, Nina Ben-Ami, Soufiane Ramadi, Michel Zlotowski. Thanks all so much. That's all for tonight. Bonsoir.